Back in 1918, a new kind of terror just swept across the entire globe. It moved way faster than any army, and it killed with this silent, brutal efficiency. Today, we call it the Spanish flu, but 100 years ago, it was a complete and terrifying mystery. And you know what? In a lot of ways, it still is. So let's dig in and uncover the secrets of this killer. To really get a handle on the scale of this thing, just look at this number, 40 million. And that's the minimum guess for the global death toll. To put that into perspective for you, that's more people than were killed in combat in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. It's just staggering. And it all happened in about 2 years. You know, what's truly wild is how little anyone actually understood what was happening. This quote here from a newspaper in Sierra Leone just nails the confusion everyone was feeling. Doctors were so baffled, the paper basically said they should stop trying to name it and just borrow a phrase from the Bible, manhu, which means, what is it? The entire world was up against a killer that didn't even have a real name. Which, of course, brings us to the first big mystery. If this virus was a total enigma, how in the world did it get stuck with such a specific and, as we're about to see, totally wrong name? Well, the answer has nothing to do with biology and absolutely everything to do with war. Okay, so let's just clear this up right off the bat. The Spanish flu did not, I repeat, did not start in Spain. The real story of how it got its name is all about information control and propaganda during a massive world war. The whole thing really boils down to this: censorship. See, World War I was raging, and the countries fighting in it were desperate to keep morale up. The absolute last thing they wanted was for their citizens to start panicking about some new plague tearing through the troops in cities. So they just didn't report on it. They kept it quiet. So here's how it played out. On one side, you have all the countries at war. The US, the UK, France, Germany. They're all censoring any news about the flu. But on the other side, you have Spain. Spain was neutral, so its press was totally free, and they were the first to report really extensively on what was happening. They even reported that their own king had gotten sick. So to the rest of the world reading the news, it looked like Spain was the epicenter, and bam, the name stuck. But the thing is, people all over the world were coming up with their own names for it. Some were really descriptive, like the Purple Death, which came from the color a victim's skin would turn. Chilling, right? Others were named after places, like Flanders fever. And some names, wow, they were more of a commentary, like this one from the Yao people in southern Africa. The disease from seeking profit in wartime. That one tells you a whole different story. All right, so the name was a historical accident. But let's move on to the next mystery, which is frankly even more terrifying than the name. It's the virus itself. It just didn't act like any flu anyone had ever seen before. It seemed to hunt a very specific kind of person. So this is how the flu is supposed to work. It's usually most dangerous for little kids whose immune systems are still getting up to speed, and for the elderly whose systems are starting to weaken. It creates this predictable U-shaped curve on a mortality chart. This is what doctors expect to see. Yeah, well, the 1918 flu didn't play by the rules at all. Instead of a U, its curve looked like a W. Sure, you had the usual spikes for the very young and the very old, but then there was this third, absolutely massive spike right in the middle, hitting young adults, people between 15 and 44 years old. The healthiest, strongest people in society were suddenly the most vulnerable. This quote from the Army's acting Surgeon General at the time just perfectly captures the horror and the confusion. It seemed like the virus was turning a person's own strength against them. Eyewitnesses said it over and over again. The strongest, fittest people were the ones who got sick and died the fastest. It just defied all medical logic. So, you've got this uniquely deadly virus that targets the healthiest people. How on earth did it become a global catastrophe so quickly? Well, the answer, once again, is all tangled up with the Great War. The machinery of war became the virus's personal delivery service. You can literally trace its journey on this timeline. It starts in March at a US Army camp. By April, it's traveled with American troops across the Atlantic to the trenches of Europe. Then, in the fall, a much deadlier second wave explodes. And then, and this is the truly tragic irony, Armistice Day. The war ends, people pour into the streets to celebrate, and those massive crowds just ignited new waves of infection all over the world. And the way it spread just seemed terrifyingly random. I mean, look at this map of the United States. You'd think there would be some kind of clear pattern, right? But there's not. States with really high death tolls, like Pennsylvania and Colorado, were right next door to states that were barely touched. It wasn't about climate, it wasn't about wealth. It was like getting struck by lightning. Okay, so now we get to what is maybe the most counterintuitive, most mind-bending part of this whole story. After all the death, all the tragedy, something really strange happened to the economy. Something that researchers are still trying to fully unpack. It sounds like a completely absurd question, right? How could an event that killed tens of millions of people, most of them in the prime of their working lives, possibly lead to anything good? It feels wrong to even ask. But when economists started crunching the numbers from the decade that followed, they found something shocking. So here it is, the unbelievable finding. In the US, the states that had higher death rates from the flu actually saw faster economic growth per person all through the 1920s. I know, that just seems to defy all logic, but the data is solid. So how is that even possible? Let's try to think about it this way. So the pandemic tragically wiped out a huge number of workers, especially those young, healthy adults we saw in that W-shaped curve. But all the stuff, the factories, the tools, the farmland, that all stayed the same. So suddenly there's more capital, more stuff for each worker who's left. In theory, that could make the remaining workers way more productive, and that could actually jumpstart the economy onto a whole new, faster growth path. And this isn't just some abstract theory. The research actually backs it up. When you look at the real data from the 1920s, and you control for all the other things you'd think would matter, like if a state's economy was mostly farming or how rich it was to begin with, the effect of the flu mortality rate is still there. It's positive, and it's statistically significant. So what does that mean in real terms? Well, for every extra death per 1,000 people in a state, its annual per capita income grew by at least an extra 0.15%. And that wasn't just a one-time bump. That was every single year for the next decade. It's a pretty stark reminder that economic data can tell some really unexpected and, honestly, deeply unsettling stories. So this all brings us to one final and kind of haunting question. How did an event of this magnitude, one that killed millions, reshaped the world, and even had these bizarre economic consequences, become known as America's forgotten pandemic? Well, it seems to be a combination of things. First, the whole thing was just shockingly fast. The deadliest parts were over in a few months, not years like a war. Second, the war itself was just sucking up all the headlines. There was just no room for another story about mass death. And finally, and this is maybe the saddest part, people at the time were just used to deadly diseases. Typhoid, cholera, diphtheria. The flu was just one more tragedy in an era already full of them. And so that's where we're left. The Spanish flu was this perfect storm of a mysterious virus, a global war, and a public that was just completely overwhelmed by tragedy. It just faded from our collective memory, buried under everything else that was happening. Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If a society can just forget a catastrophe on this scale, what other vital lessons from our own past might we be overlooking right now?